Good morning, everyone. Today is March. What are we up to? The 21st already of 2020. And this is the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society Science Chat. Let's see here. So today we have Bob, and we have Carl, and we have James, and we have Ian. All right, how you guys doing? So I was wondering if you guys have any hot topics you would like to discuss this week.
Well, I don't know if it's appropriate, Franklin, but a couple of weeks ago in my absence, I noted that you devoted a session to discussing the virus. I suppose it's sort of a philosophical thing that perhaps we could touch upon briefly. We as dissidents are used to questioning everything. I mean, it's sort of we aspire to going into university maybe and having the lecturer say, look, everything I say now must be questioned. You mustn't accept me as an authority giving scientific expostulation that cannot be questioned. You must question everything. Now, we question physics, we question very numerical sciences and so on. Now, is it appropriate that we question medicine at a time like this? It seems to be watching all the media that the politicians are basically just puppets of the established medical profession. The sort of the WHO and the local medical people running the health services and so on. And there's an international consensus on this. Now, one could say it's too dangerous to question this at all. Maybe we should just follow exactly what the medical people are saying. And that's what they're saying. I mean, they're all saying, oh, the chief medical officer and the WHO, whatever they say, just follow it. Don't even question it. So I suppose I'm really just posing a question as to whether raising our normal skepticism and our normal questioning is appropriate at this time, or whether, as maybe a lot of people think, it's irresponsible.
Well, I think as dissidents, yeah, I think it's always our job to question what's going on. So I'm kind of wondering, so if you guys think that there's anything that's going on that doesn't seem quite right. Now, the only thing that really stands out in my mind is this whole recommendation to not wear masks, because this seems to be a case of do as I say, not as I do. So, and even this week, I posted something about people asking, how long are these masks supposed to last, right? And I think 3M will say, like 8 hours, right? But these masks, I just said that, well, they last basically as long as they last, right? As long as you don't have a hard time breathing through them, as long as they're clean, they're not moist, as long as they look like they're still new, you could probably keep on using that thing indefinitely. But yet we have people trying to figure out, how long did it take for me to throw out my mask? And it's like, how long does your vacuum cleaner bag last, right? Until it's full, right? I suppose. And you couldn't really give any indication, like, are you supposed to throw out your vacuum bag after, 3 months or something like that, right? How long are these things good for? And I think it's important that, people use these things as long as they can so that they're not, throwing out perfectly good resources. Now, here in the U.S., it's been like 2 or 3 weeks, and we have not been able to find any kind of mask in the store anywhere. All you find are the little signs saying no mask, no sanitizers, no toilet paper, and it's been like weeks that this stuff has been missing. Now, I could understand for maybe a week, maybe the supply chain would have a chance to catch up, but doesn't seem that way. It seems like these things are out permanently, right? We're not going to see a surgical mask in the store ever, it would seem. And so that's kind of troublesome and worrisome, but they're not, I don't think they're really addressing that too much in the media. They're just saying, you don't need a mask, and curiously, I saw now they're saying that you don't need an N95 mask. Now they're saying that the standard just surgical mask is good enough, right? And or they're trying to like say that the healthcare providers, right? So they're like taking the recommendation and like really lowering it, right? But that just doesn't seem right? Because first of all, if the mask works to protect our healthcare workers, then I think it would protect us. And I think other countries are taking stances where they hand out a mask to everybody and require them to wear it. And so that just, as a skeptic, doesn't seem right to me. That's all. Although here, Iran, I was out last week, and really, the only time I go out is to go shopping for food, and that's like once a week. So I get out of this place like once a week. Aside from when I go and work on my yard or whatever. Other than that, I've been imprisoned here the entire week. But what about other people? Are there things that you've seen in the news that just don't seem quite right? Let's see, who else we got here? We have got, Harry's here, yes. So, Harry, how is your internet connection this week? Let's see, I think your mic is open.
I upgraded to high-speed internet, fiber optic, and it works much better.
Oh, excellent. Yes, you're coming in great now. Now, we had discussed the COVID virus about 2 weeks ago, and you had asked what it was like for us folks in Seattle, the hot zone. Well, apparently in the last 2 weeks, the entire United States has become the hot zone. New York has surpassed, the East Coast has surpassed us now, right? So how are things going in your neck of the woods as far as this whole coronavirus thing?
Well, I'm not really sure what that means. I mean, the state of Virginia has reported something like 100 and some cases. And I guess the news media is trying to make that sound like Armageddon.
It's Coronamageddon.
Doesn't seem like a lot of cases to me, given a lot of the people in the state of Virginia. But it's kind of typical. I mean, the places where it's showing up are places where people have been doing international traveling, government facilities, Washington, D.C. area primarily, where you have a transient population, a lot of immigrant population, a lot of people traveling to foreign countries.
Are the schools closed down in Virginia?
Yes, everything. Yeah, the schools, I think, are closed everywhere in the U.S. I don't know whether there may be some states out in the middle of the country where they're not closed, but they're closed here, yeah.
Well, there was some controversy over the closing of the schools. There was, I guess, a study done about, whether closing the schools significantly slows the spread of things like this. And the answer was basically, no. But everyone has closed the schools. And so I think that might be an area that we might be skeptical about, since it's causing a massive disruption. And the amount of disruption is incredible in that, they're saying don't open the schools for like another, month or two or ever, actually. And but it is kind of testing our ability to do remote learning and actually remote everything. So everyone's doing things remote, like my church is doing everything remote. Of course, they were in a good position to do so because they were already transmitting by YouTube and Facebook all along. So instead of just like 20 people showing up for the broadcast, now we've got like 150 showing up for the broadcast. And so
that's all very good, but most people don't want to sit around in the house and be in prison for, like, that was the term that you use.
Yes, imprisoned. Yes, and I just saw on the news, all the
I
spring breakers.
understand that in Europe, the people in Europe are kind of pretty much you get fined if you go out of the house, is what people are saying. I don't know whether that's true or not. What's going on where you are, Ian?
You have to unmute there, Ian. Yeah, Ian, what's going on across the pond? You have to
Can't hear
unmute
Ian.
yourself.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. Yes. Well, I was going to mention something related to that, but I mean, in answer to your question, that hasn't occurred here in Ireland anyway. But some emergency legislation has been put through the Parliament last week, which could lead to that. I think it gives them powers to do something like that. But I'm actually worried, maybe Europe more so than North America, I don't know. But it is going to a stage where, first of all, there is possibly going to be an increasing amount of social displeasure at what is conceived to be not acceptable politically. And it could even, I don't want to be an Armageddon person here, but it could even result in violence or, racial or other sort of disapproval. And then it could also result in the enactment or the going through of these enacted laws, which give the authorities power to force people to stay in rooms. Now, my whole skepticism, I suppose, is very, very fundamental. I mean, what worries me in a way about this is this consensus. This, Franklin mentioned maybe one thing or two about the masks, but there is so much of a consensus. You listen to the news from whatever country, and the advice is basically the same. And as people like David de Hilster, for example, say, wherever we see consensus in science, we should put on the warning lights. I mean, in the UK, and I think in the US as well, maybe a little while ago, you were endeavoring to resolve the problem by not restricting people so much, and hence hoping that this would establish sort of a herd immunity. I mean, basically what we've done for ordinary flu, the major flu epidemic of 2009, which we hardly heard about, which killed loads of people. And to me, that seemed maybe a reasonable approach. But the opposite approach was coming from maybe Central European countries, which said, no, that's ridiculous. And you better close everything down. And the more things close down, the better. And then this whole business about restricting people to houses, which just instinctively, I'm sure is wrong. I mean, I went out for a very long walk yesterday just to get fresh air and to get into the countryside. I think it could come to what you're saying. It isn't maybe quite as bad as has been reported generally in Europe, but it is getting worse. And I think the media is doing this because people in one country are looking at the media and saying, oh, look what they're doing in X, so we better do the same. And they're not doing that much in the Netherlands or something, or they're not doing that much in the UK, or they're not doing that much in the US. So they should really do more. Now, the one sign of maybe slight optimism is I understand that the information coming out from China now is that it's contained to a certain extent, and that the number of new cases has diminished quite substantially over the last number of days. So that might be something for the future.
Now, one thing that I ran across, now, of course, you can't believe everything you see on the internet, but I thought it was a fairly reputable thing saying that the UK, they weren't doing all these things like closing the schools and stuff like that. Because you mentioned that whole herd immunity thing, that the opposite philosophy is to just let it run through the population and get it over with, right? It's like ripping the bandage off, right? Just do it quick, right? All right. Although I think what people are really seeing is what's happening in Italy, which is, modern European state, modern medical systems. And what happens is that the hospital systems get overwhelmed. And that's actually the main problem, is that, there's only so many ventilators to go around and everybody needs one who needs hospitalization. So what happens is that it's the local hospitals no longer have the capacity. So that's why I think that's true, that what they're trying to do is that they're trying to make it so that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. Although what worries me from a scientific standpoint, I've looked at the the charts showing the new cases, and even up to like yesterday or so, the number of cases continue to rise exponentially in the United States.
You have to remember, Franklin, that they did a intensive testing. I don't know about where you live, but here in Virginia, they started having intensive testing, and people would drive up to the hospital, and they had a tent set up, and they tested you for coronavirus. And there was long lines of cars in the beginning. I mean, long lines of cars. So, we're still seeing the effects of the initial testing phase.
Well, I would think that would show up as a gigantic initial bump. But the funny thing is, if you look at the logarithmic chart, straight line, absolutely dead straight. So it's not, all the testing didn't even create a bump.
That can't happen because logarithmic systems eventually run into physical limitations.
Well, I mean, that's what they're worried about, because if you got a curve that's going up logarithmically, then the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed in like an hour here, right? Because it's doubling every 3 to 5 days is what the deal is. So
obviously, the increase in testing will give rise to reporting of more cases. But I mean, my skepticism is extreme, really, in this regard. There have been a number of scandals in recent times about the medical people not having predicted, with screening, for example, of types of cancers or something like that. So my view is that they are ultra cautious now. Now, I don't know how they actually screen and what the results and what the uncertainty bars are for this virus. But I mean, it's quite possible that if I went in now and said I'm worried, I have a bit of a sniffle, they'd come out and they say yes, and perhaps the test would be slightly uncertain, but they would say we better aim on the safe side and say that he has it. So my skepticism, I'm not a medical person, but my skepticism is I actually don't really believe all the results, or I'm skeptical about all the results. I think they may be being very, very cautious and saying that there are cases where perhaps there isn't a certainty that there are cases.
Well, let's see. I'm sharing my screen here. So this is like new coronavirus cases announced in the U.S. each day, and this is almost a perfect exponential curve here. So I would think this should be at least a little bit steeper, or would have dropped a little bit, but no, it's just totally perfect exponential curve here. So I don't even see the result of increased testing on this chart. Basically, that was just kind of like the kind of point that I was making, is that there's increased testing. They were finding more, but it seems to be still a mathematically a perfectly logarithmic.
In the state of Virginia,
sure.
There are still only something like 120 cases of coronavirus in the state of Virginia. I mean, that's really not that many.
No, the numbers wise, it's actually rather low. I mean, the more concerning statistic I think they need to track are the number of people that's in the hospitals, right? Because most of the people who catch this thing are not going to need to go to the hospital. But
you're not sending the people to the hospital.
Pardon?
My understanding is that if you test positive, they're not necessarily sending you to the hospital.
Yeah, most people do not need to go to the hospital, but we actually don't worry about those people, because most people they'll take care of themselves.
I think what's happening is they're saying if you test positive, okay, then you're supposed to,
Self-quarantine. Yeah,
yourself.
self-quarantine.
And it's not real clear to me whether testing positive what that necessarily means. But I know of one person in my community that supposedly tested positive. That person's not in the hospital.
Yeah, people only go to the hospitals if they have breathing difficulties, and definitely those people needed to go to the hospital. So otherwise, if you can feel terrible, but as long as you can still breathe, then you self-quarantine and try not to get anyone else sick.
But they are also saying in some reports that most people are going to get this, are going to be in a state where they would be tested positive. And they'll get over it. It'll be just like a bad flu or something like that. And it's the minority of people who are at risk, like the medically challenged or the elderly and so on. Now, if that is the case, and I don't know, sometimes they say one thing, sometimes another, but if that is the case, well, then you are better letting it spike out rather than flatten the curve and let it go on maybe for a very long period of time. I don't know if most people are going to be infected with this, but I have seen some reports where they're saying that's going to happen. It'll be in excess of 60% of people are going to get it, and maybe more. Well, if that's so, and they're going to recover, well, then the herd immunity proposition is actually the superior one. We've isolated ourselves, to such an extent now that we're just drawing the thing out and out, and it appears that it's going to make no difference in the long term.
Well, I'm just, that is something you got to worry about, because now here in China, it was like second day that they didn't have any new cases of the coronavirus, which does show that with sufficient draconian measures, you can stop the thing, right? And now Italy has surpassed China as far as numbers of deaths go. So I'm kind of looking to China to see, what's going on. Now, the question is what's going to happen now that they've managed to get the number of new cases under control. And there are still a number of people who remain uninfected. And it would seem like you would have to completely eradicate this virus in order to make it safe for the people who have not been infected. And actually, they're saying that you can be reinfected, although there just seems to be a lack of, reliable data on, just how long you're infectious for and what the quarantine period is and the things like that. I mean, one of the frightening things about this is that, we had all these NBA basketball players tested for coronavirus who were asymptomatic, and a couple of them had it, right? They're just walking around feeling perfectly well, spreading the virus. And that is probably the worst thing about it, because not unless you can test 100% of everybody and find everybody who has it at any one given time, you're never going to be able to basically stop it. So
this is all very interesting, Franklin, but I'm not really sure that this is within the purview of our discussion group. Maybe we should talk about something more pleasant.
Pleasant, perhaps, but this is Science Chat. This is like we all get around in our coffee shop and talk about whatever is on our mind. We could talk about Britney Spears if we wanted to.
We're sort of, if you want to relate this to a science discussion, essentially what this boils down to is we're relying on the expertise of people who have been certified, whatever that word certified means, as experts. Okay. And, presumably, the experts are telling us, what the facts are that are known. But of course that again, you don't really know what experts, whether the experts that you particularly hear in any particular discussion really know what they're talking about. And so, that raises the question of can scientists make mistakes? That would be a legitimate discussion, I suppose. But we don't know. So we're sort of down at the bottom of the food chain. We're supposed to believe what the news media tells us, and news media supposedly produces experts, and the experts presumably know what they're talking about. So that's kind of the situation.
Well, that's why I raised the matter in the first place. I mean, you're hearing so much about this COVID-19 on the news and the print media and so on, that one doesn't need to have a further discussion about the details. But and you also had this call some weeks ago, but I was raising this very fundamental point. We know and we have some experience that there is pressure on scientists, say physicists, for example, people questioning the relativity theory, something which is accepted by 99.9% of people in the know and people not in the know, and the ordinary man on the street and so on. But we know that careers could be ruined if somebody says, look, there's some data here which is questionable, out, you're not in the mainstream. Now, I think it is hard to conceive that this is not to some extent happening in medicine as well. That if you have some medical people who say, well, maybe what this is wrong, they say, well, your career could be finished unless you keep your mouth shut. So that's why I raised the point. And medicine is a less exact science than physics. So perhaps this is happening even more and more, and maybe most of it is a bit of a sham. And I suppose it's a legitimate question for us as dissidents to ask. But I suppose the rejoinder might be made that this is such an important and critical time that we don't have the luxury of doing this. I mean, it's so what the theory of relativity is wrong, and we have to adjust GPS or something like that. But here, if we don't listen to the experts, and the experts are right, there could be dire consequences. So I'm just questioning that whole approach.
Yeah, no, it's life and death. It's not just us dissidents just discussing things. Although here, I just ran into this graph here about new cases of coronaviruses reported in the U.S. by day. It looks like here's some good news in that, we can see the gigantic spike, but then today hasn't ended, but it looks like at least the previous day that the number of cases have gone down. And I guess as dissidents, we have to, this is where the science is, which is interpreting data, right? And then you can see in the total cases that, it seems like a perfect exponential curve up until like the past 2 days or so, when it seems to have a dip. The direction seems to have changed significantly. So maybe all the social distancing thing is perhaps having the intended effect. So that's good news.
See, one could even be more controversial and, question the motives and the validity of the data. I've been looking for some time at the pressure on various professions and operatives to produce these KPIs, key performance indicators. And, we found this had gone to an extent. For example, the police here had been falsifying the figures for stopping drink drivers. Because they could say, well, we stopped so many thousands last month or something instead of so many hundreds, and this was improving their careers. And there was a lot of pressure by the management on ordinary operatives. I have to justify what we're doing and make those figures higher and so on. And so. This is conspiracy theories to a certain extent, but we had maybe a number of years ago, the University of East Anglia in England was falsifying research figures for global warming. And that came out, and some red faces. But on the other hand, they said, well, this is such an important thing, and that the world is going to be destroyed in a few years, that it doesn't matter if we exaggerate the situation a little, even though it's meant to be science, and we give false data, because it'll get people's consciousness more in line. Now, the same thing could be happening here, maybe sometimes, maybe mostly unconsciously, maybe sometimes consciously. So there could be pressure on a lot of these operatives, you know, oh, you're testing people. Why did you only have 1 or 2 results today? There must be more results. Proportionately, you must have 100. You know, there's a pressure on people. And if they're seen to be producing these, the politicians are going to give them more money. We have here, I don't know if this is singular, by the way, but there's been an announcement made just in the last few days that anybody who's retired from the health services in the last number of years is invited back and will be given a job and will be paid and so on. So I'm sure there are health chiefs who are saying, look, we have to maintain our system, and they might justify it by saying, look, we need this to help the people, but we really have to get the funding from the government. So we better have these figures right. We better have these KPIs right. We better be in line with what's happening in other countries. So it's a slight conspiracy theory, I suppose, and I am conceding that maybe much of it is done unconsciously, but it is a human trait that we find in all other endeavors. We find it with the financial institutions. I said we found it with the police. We find it with the politicians. We find it with the public service. We find it with private industry. You know, we find it all over the place.
Well, Ian, I think a much more interesting question. Well, anyway, maybe it's not more interesting, but this whole business where they closed the schools and they closed the universities here too as well. And, you know, it raises the question as to whether or not these degrees and education is really all that important. It looks to me like they're saying that the purpose of function of the secondary school system is no more than babysitting.
And to boot, Harry, here's something they've done here. Again, I don't know if this is unique. They had some oral examinations. I think they were mainly languages coming up for the leaving certificate, matriculation. The written examinations would come up in the summer, and they're thinking of postponing those. But what they've done for the oral examinations is they've quashed them, and they've given everybody 100%. Now, they were asked to justify that, and they said, oh, most people do very well in the orals. They get 80% or something. So the other 20% were, who might fail, we're giving them 100%. And a person who's very, very good would get the same as a person who's very, very bad. So that would add to what you're saying, Harry, that maybe it's an admission that it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, they want to cancel the government performance tests that grade the school system. In other words, they give these, I can't remember, I think they call them SQL tests, which are basically whether or not the educational system is performing effectively to educate the students. And of course, the first thing that the governor of our state wanted to do was cancel those tests.
And they've claimed to be very fair, because they've said no student is going to be inconvenienced by the coronavirus. So everybody's going to get 100% in the examination. We're not sort of discounting it, or we're not giving them 50%.
So you're raising the issue that maybe this is not really what's going on. Isn't really so much a response to the medical problem, but a social. An opportunity to create some social change.
Yeah, I'm just putting out all these questions, which, if I were a journalist, for example, I mean, maybe what I'm saying is ridiculous, but we can discuss it. If I were a journalist and I wrote something like that into my sub-editor, well, his polite response would be, no, we couldn't publish that. That wouldn't be accepted politically or by the populace. And his less polite one would be, get out, you're fired, you're sacked, that's the end of it. So it just reminded me that there's an analogy between this and what we have been experiencing over the years with regard to questioning fundamental physical theories and cosmology. And it's just that the result is different. It's maybe life and death, as Franklin says in this case, but it's exactly the same human phenomenon.
Well, life and death is a much more persuasive argument. I mean, when whether Einstein is right or wrong doesn't really nobody's survival. I know that Herbert Dingle said, we're messing around with nuclear energy and there could be a catastrophic mistake, but nobody really bought into that theory.
Yeah, and that indicates another thing that I've been thinking about, and it's sort of catastrophic theories, like, for example, when they were setting up this LHC, which we have certain views on, but in Geneva, there were people protesting that they're going to create a black hole that's going to destroy the universe or something. Now, and I've been just enumerating these ideas. When I was at college, for example, they were all talking about acid rain, and they were saying, well, we're having sulfur particles and nitrogen emanating from pollution and fossil fuels, and that's going to combine with water in the upper atmosphere, and in a few years' time we're going to get acid, sulfuric acid and nitric acid, falling down onto the earth, and it's going to be destroyed. And this is not just a scientific thing, it's a major thing. It's going to destroy the world. Now, then that was sort of forgotten about a bit. Then the next one possibly was the ozone layer. They said, we're going to be fried by ultraviolet rays which are coming through the ozone layer. There's a big hole there, and even if we try to ban certain chemicals and CFCs and so on, it'll take ages to clear it up, and we're going to be destroyed. It's going to destroy civilization. They're all different things. Then when I was finishing college, we had the first energy crisis. They said, you'll never be able to use fossil fuels again. There are only a few years left, and you're finished. And that the same thing happened again with the next oil crisis. Actually, there are hundreds of years reserves of fossil fuels. But if you had said that at the time, you would have been thrown out. Then there was, I don't know.
Global warming.
Sorry?
Global warming.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. I'm trying to do it chronologically.
Yeah, there were a couple other things between that.
Maybe global warming came in, but I was going to say Y2K first. They said the world is coming to an end because the computers are only taking the last 2 digits of the year, and the year 2000 will be taken as 1900. Planes will fall out of the sky. The whole financial system will go. The end of civilization. Medicine will go. We'll have plagues. We'll have a virus coming in, and that's the end of it. And that, you better come to me. Then global warming. Global warming is coming at such a rate that we'll all be fried, and everything will be destroyed in the world, and we won't be able to survive, and so on. And then they said, well, yeah, but certain areas are cooling, and so they said, oh, it's climate change, and any catastrophe is climate change, and it could be global warming, it could be global cooling. And then there came floods and storms, and the world is ending because we're getting these things as we never had them before. It's climate change. And again, on all these things, by the way, these factors, if any person were skeptical during the time, he would basically be ostracized, and that would be the least that would happen. Now, another thing in this part of the world, I know
not unless you're Trump.
Well, yeah, I was going to. Well, I tell you what's going to come to next. I was going to say Brexit. It's even a word. They don't have to say the UK is considering leaving the European Union. Well, those are many words. But if you say Brexit is the end of the world. It's going to be the way we never thought about it. One of the major members of the European Union is leaving, and it's going to destroy everything. And and it was on the news the whole time. Now, this is the latest. And by the way, I don't think I've mentioned them all, but these are, extreme apocalyptic phenomena. To me, it's almost like a quasi-religious. In the Middle Ages, they would say, well, the Black Death is going to kill us because we've been impious and God is punishing us with this, and there's no resolution except prayer or something. And now all these things are, I don't know, apocalyptic. They're a secular
End of
apocalyptic.
times. I just saw there was an article on locusts in Africa or something. I don't know, but of course they always have
Anyway,
locusts.
Ian,
But
I think the major negative impact of this whole thing for me is the fact that you can't buy anything in a grocery store. We're going to the grocery store more than we need to because there are shortages, and so you have a shortage, and you say, "Oh, I need to get some milk," and you go to the grocery store. There's no milk, and then the next day you go to the grocery store hoping that there'll be milk, and there's no milk, and you go to the grocery store the next day hoping there'll be milk, and there's no milk, and next thing you know, you've been to the grocery store, all these times looking for something that you need, and it's not there. And to me, that's the biggest problem.
that's because you haven't hoarded properly, right?
Toilet paper is the big problem. Can't buy toilet paper.
You needed to hoard early, right? That's
Well,
why I
people
have
are
this shelf stable packaged milk, right? So I've got a few of those, right?
Yeah, but
And I managed to get a hold of a package of those masks at the dollar store before this all became popular, right? Because you're never going to see one of those ever again.
a package of what?
The surgical masks.
Oh,
You can get a package of 10 from the dollar store, right? And I got a package of those. I should have loaded up, I suppose. But yeah, it's a problem. So I see we've got a couple of other people in the live room. Actually, we have like eight or so people in the live room. So I usually try and put everybody up. I see we have Ray Gallucci here with us as well. So, but generally speaking, I presume that if you're in our live room that you want to speak, and I'll try and put you up. But right now, there's too many people in the live room. So if you just want to just watch, then you can do that. But otherwise, I'll just try and keep you up here. So, let's talk with Ray. Ray, how are you doing? I haven't seen you since the conference. Well, so. But generally speaking, I presume that if you're in our live room, here, but you, Ray, seem to be like way behind. There's too many people in the live room. I can hear your feedback there.
Sorry, Franklin, but I'm hearing what you say repeated maybe a few seconds later. I don't know if there's a sort of an echo.
Yeah, I think that Ray's got a pretty big lag in his setup there. But glad to have him here. But let's see, we all have Michael Antesky here. Let's see here. Ray, did you want to say something there?
No, I'm just listening in.
Okay. All right.
Usually I can't participate in these because I have activities on Saturday, but naturally now there's no activities at all on Saturday. So I figured I can start listening in.
Yeah, I think maybe the science chat will become more popular now, because that's the other major thing is that you can't even take a staycation because they've closed down all of the museums and all the restaurants and canceled all the concerts and anything that you could possibly go to. So
one of the comments earlier, I almost wish they just let this thing run its course instead of trying to lock everybody down. Maybe let the people who are more vulnerable self-quarantine or something like that. Let the rest of the population run it out. And since most people recover anyway, get their immunity, and instead of basically shutting the world off.
So that would be basically all of us. All of us dissidents are usually way over 60. So
I'm over 60, but I mean, I take my chances. I mean, I would rather. I mean, this is. It's like a nightmare out of the Twilight Zone, the way I see it.
So your suggestion would be that anyone over 60 should self-quarantine, and then we should put all the kids back to school.
I don't say everybody over 60. No, not everybody over 60. I mean, if you look at the Italy statistics, what was it? 99% of the people who came down with something or died had other illnesses. So, I mean, it's basically if people who have an illness and they're afraid of catching it, yeah, they can self-quarantine themselves. But to shut down the entire world over this, I mean, it's not a fatal flu. It's not the
It is
bubonic
if you die
plague.
of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think you're at risk, you take your precautions. But the majority of people aren't at risk. 98% of the people aren't at risk, except of catching it. I think the main problem they've shut the world down is not for fear of exorbitant number of deaths, but because of the overwhelming of the hospitals, etc. That they can't handle.
Yeah, I think that is the main concern, is the hospitals overflowing and people having to make life and death decisions of who gets a ventilator and who doesn't, because that's what's going to happen. Because I saw there's
people need hospitalization. I don't know.
Well, apparently it's a lot more than a standard flu, right? Because that was one of the things that I was asked. It's like, well, the flu kills 30,000 people in the United States every year, right? It's like, well, why doesn't that cause this gigantic panic like every single year then? Because that's way more than the coronavirus is going to kill. But it seemed that the answer is that that happens over a long period of time. So we're able to handle that 30,000 people through the system. But what happened with the coronavirus is that goes up exponentially. So yeah, there's exponential rise in the number of people showing up to the hospital.
You go to your doctor, you get your medicine, you go back home. That's the difference. Like I said,
usually it causes a severe respiratory disease. So it's called like SARS. And it causes you to go onto a respirator and need like 100% oxygen. And that's what the hospitalizations are for, because literally you die of asphyxiation. You're not getting enough oxygen.
Now, I saw something yesterday on Principia Scientific International that the UK found some antibodies that they had stored for almost 20 years from someone who had died of SARS, and they thought that might be effective against this. And I'm just wondering if anything's been pursued on that. That was an interesting story. Of course, I haven't heard anything on the news about it. It was just on, anybody follows Principia Scientific International. That was, and that's out of the UK. That was on the news yesterday.
Ray, I think there have been a lot of proposed claims that people have found treatment cures and vaccines, and I've read a number of those, and supposedly, so that's a question of that might be of scientific discussion interest, which is, how do you go about evaluating all of these claims that so-and-so found a cure, so-and-so found a vaccine? I've seen lots of stories. I wouldn't call them lots of stories, but I've seen stories. Israel supposedly has a cure, and some group in Massachusetts has a cure, not a cure, a vaccine, and some other. Then I saw a story that in France they claim that they have a regimen, a treatment regimen that's been 100% successful. And so,
I think
how so
Japan said something similar
about all this.
Yeah, I was thinking about
Japan
that.
Supposedly had some success with China with testing something they had in China as well.
Yeah, you think that if there are any solutions out there that China would know about them by now. But I think it's important that, as scientists during a crisis, that we need to basically throw out the old timelines, and basically they have done that. They've actually already have a trial of a vaccine here in the Seattle area. People are getting it, but I think we can't, as scientists, kind of wait around for the kind of studies that we might otherwise have to do. Because right now it's like a gigantic experiment going around. It's like if you think you have a cure, then they should just do a study and say, okay, we gave these 100 people the medicine, and then there was 100 other people who didn't get it just because we didn't give it to them. And you can do your trials, that way. and probably, if it's not going to kill people, you should probably, try anything that is anecdotally seems to help, I suppose.
Well, especially on those cases that are probably not going to live. There's nothing to lose trying some of these solutions on that. It's kind of curious that they shut down California, the whole state. They shut down the whole state of New York and I guess Illinois, yet Washington State didn't shut down. Did they shut down Seattle or?
Well, everyone's been told to, they've shut things down by the virtue of the fact that they didn't give you any place else to go, right? I think it'll drive around. It's like, I saw a funny video. They say, this is what Seattle was like when we were growing up 30 years ago, which the guy's just driving down I-5 down to downtown with no traffic in the middle of the day, right? Which it's practically unheard of. So it like California, well, San Francisco has declared, shelter in place, but pretty much what else are you going to do, right? They've taken everything else away, right? So
yeah,
I guess you can go to the parks, but they've even closed some parks or things like that. And some people were.
I was at the park yesterday. I was sitting there. I was watching the kids on the swings. The park ranger comes over, kicks the kids off the swings, and locks down all the swings. So now the kids can't even go on any of the playground things.
Yeah, I saw a similar thing. Yeah, I saw a similar thing here where I guess they had, like, say, taped over the tennis courts, and there are people complaining, "Oh, you guys should be ashamed of yourself breaking in there and using the tennis courts." And although the general thing was like, "Oh, come on, get over yourselves," right? It's like,
and it's interesting that I think you observe this, that it's a reaction to a new phenomenon which we haven't experienced exactly before, and it's interesting how humankind is very much worried about new phenomena. I mean, we haven't taken the same sort of action with regard to the ordinary flu, which is killing loads of people every year, depending upon what country you're in. Now, the other thing is we've shut down society for something which perhaps is dubious. I mean, maybe like Ray, I think was probably agreeing with my thing that perhaps it might be better to allow it to peak and go down. But we're closing down society for this unknown phenomenon, when all we'd have to do is, if we banned the private motor car, we'd save so many lives a year. In the United States, probably millions. Over here, I don't know, hundreds every year or something. I was reading an article recently that we had sort of over 30 years of very great violence in Northern Ireland, killing hundreds of people and so on. But every single year, there were more people killed on the roads there than the violence. But we didn't think, all we'd have to do is ban the motor car and we'd save so many lives. No, we haven't done that. When the motor car came first, of course, we required a man with a red flag to walk in front of it, and the speed limit was 5 miles per hour. But I mean, basically, we got used to it, and we continued, and that was the situation. It's part of life, and we don't worry about it. And the same thing could happen with these sort of diseases. Once we get used to them, we sort of contain them, and we take them as part of natural life. And there's a risk entailed with them, but it doesn't justify closing down society.
That's my basic worry. My basic worry is that this is never going to go away. Is that maybe we'll tamp it down, but it'll always be around. And now everybody, over 80 is going to worry about getting this for the rest of their lives, right? They have to, and you can't tell who's got it and who doesn't, right? Even if you stay away from people who are coughing, that wouldn't be enough, because there are people walking around completely asymptomatic, spreading it around anywho. So is that something that you're going to have to worry about for the rest of their lives?
It's a new phenomenon, as I say, Franklin. I mean, we have loads of other things which are affecting old people, cancer and other viruses and diabetes and God knows what not. And we say, unfortunately, that's a fact of life, and we try to mitigate it. But this is a new phenomenon. I mean, you know, it sounds a bit flippant, but you know, there are diseases out there, and we all have to die at some stage. You know, even if this thing diminishes, which I think it will, to zero, we'll have other viruses coming in, other mutations, and the more we do in trying to get vaccines and things like that, the more we're encouraging perhaps further mutations. So maybe in the long run it's counterproductive. I'm very skeptical about the conventional success of medicine to resolve matters. We seem to cure one thing or resolve one matter, and then we get another disease. And tuberculosis now, which we thought we got rid of, it seems to be coming back. You mentioned SARS and Ebola. Those are another two phenomena I might have mentioned in my catastrophe list. Some people say there'll never be international travel again with Ebola. And then there are political things as well. I mean, the ordinary person in the Western world, I think, people I spoke to a few years ago, were psyched up to believe that in 45 seconds, Saddam Hussein could destroy the world with weapons of mass destruction. It was the biggest crisis ever. So we better do something now. We don't have any time to do anything about it. And we went on this crusade, if you like, you know, which caused untold problems. It's just human nature. I don't know, just panicking. And you talk about, and Harry talks about not being things in the shops and so on, you know, panic buying. I remember during the fuel crisis, you know, there were these long petrol queues, you know, and I was queuing up on one occasion, I don't know, for a very long time. And the chap in front of me, the petrol spilt out, I think, when he put in, you know, a fraction of a gallon. He'd queued up maybe for more than an hour to put in a pint of fuel or something like that. You know, I better have it full up all the time.
I remember that when I used to commute to college, and I remember waiting in lines for 2 hours on odd and even days, depending on your license plate, when you would go and fill, and you actually had to have less than half a tank in order to even go there. And yeah, I remember that back in the early 70s. And that lasted about, I don't know, 3-4 months.
Concerning what Franklin said on the fact that this may become a seasonal phenomena, there's an idea for a new business that clinics, private clinics could be set up for the elderly to come in to be intentionally infected with this virus, and the best treatment in respirators and whatever is available there, so they recover from it, so that they are then inoculated for future seasons. You know, if this is a seasonal flu, say in the northern hemisphere in the cold months, and then in the southern hemisphere in the warmer months. So that's just sort of a crazy little idea that just popped into my head of how to get rich from this, to offer a service to elderly people to come and get their immunity established for this particular virus. Now, there are several things that I'd like to mention. It looks like we may be in the midst of a beta test being run. For example, consider this sequence, and probably everyone here has read articles on this, but let's put it into a sequence. A Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, his father was very big in the eugenics movement. The movement saying that we must, of course, reduce the population. That's Microsoft's Bill Gates. Then we have Bill Gates owning a company that patents the Wuhan, COVID-19 virus, okay? And then this company runs a computer simulation as to how many millions of people would die if this virus were released into the human population, okay? Now we have, after that simulation, which was just a few weeks before and this patent and so forth, was just a few weeks before the outbreak in Wuhan, the Wuhan outbreak as a beta test. And so it could be that the powers, the eugenics advocates behind the scenes are observing to see how well their simulation is going to predict the outcome. And on the basis of this beta test for this sort of bioweapon, as it were, the future they can then perfect it. So that it actually kills more people. But of course, if a parasite kills the host, its spread is limited. So this has to be very carefully balanced, that it doesn't kill the host too fast, so that the host has time to spread the virus. And the other thing that is a beta test, I think, aside from the eugenics angle I just outlined, is control of the population. In order for certain powerful entities to maintain their power, they must be able to control the population. So this may be a big beta test, is how far they can go in terms of limiting the freedoms, both of free speech, in terms of people opposing this hysteria that the media is constantly banging on, or drumming out, as it were, and how far they can limit the freedoms and rights of assembly, the rights of mobility. Like even you have Germany has closed its borders to foreign nations. I mean, the EU of the globalists is completely crumbling now. It's sort of each man for themselves. So we have the beta test for the eugenic properties of this bioweapon. How good is it? And then we have the beta test of how far we can control people and that they will accept without revolting. Okay. And then I wrote one other thing down here, the business. I covered that. Yeah. Our new business, let's name the company. Let's see. We can start selling stock. We'll have a luxurious resort area where wealthy, elderly people with complicating conditions can come and be intentionally inoculated or infected with this virus and then recover, so they don't have their immunity. That might be a great stock, a great company, very profitable.
Okay, so that's what the virus came from the United States story is. I understand it, right? Okay, but I didn't hear the whole story that Bill Gates had something to do with it. It's all his idea to thin the herd. Since it seems, if you look at the mortality rates, it just seems very effective against older people. And I'm not exactly sure what this, other complicating conditions are. Since it seems to kill perfectly good people who didn't have any complicating circumstances at all. But
that's true. But certainly, if you have reduced respiratory capacity, say from smoking or whatever, that would be one of the complicating conditions. But otherwise, I agree with the drift of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the hope is that they've got the vaccine already in trials, and that hopefully we'll eradicate it that way. Because we did eradicate things like SARS and MERS. I mean, that was totally eradicated. It only lasted a little while, but they eradicated those because they were so much more deadly, right? It killed.
Well, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919. I mean, it's not even agreed how many that killed. Some people say between 20 and 50 million, some less. But and also there are various theories as to how that originated. I mean, it's really a misnomer to call it a Spanish anything. It seems to be that during the war there was censorship, and you couldn't say that this sort of flu was ravaging one of the Allied nations, or indeed the Axis nations, Spain was neutral, so information could come out of Spain about all these cases. So they started calling it the Spanish flu because that's all they knew about. That's all that was reported. But there are various theories as to whether it was troops living in very damp and overcrowded conditions, or one theory is that it originated in China as well. Another is that it originated in Europe. I mean, they don't really know. And, you know, I don't know. They took some precautions. It just ran its course again. It killed, you know, maybe millions of people. And then there was a sort of a herd immunity from it. I did see pictures of policemen in San Francisco or something in 1918 wearing masks. I did see that. Whether that had much of an effect, I'm not sure.
Yeah, mask wearing was much more popular back then. Let's see here. So we've talked about the flu for about an hour, and let's see. I think, but Musser wants to change the topic here. Let's see if we can get into our usual science here. Okay. So in case you talk physics, and I think that's what we'll do now. Let's talk physics. Please talk about inertia, especially about the straight line objects move when in motion and no forces influencing it. Is it straight line? What is straight in respect to? All right. Well, let's see. Let's talk about that. Now, I did.
With respect to elementary geometry, straight is the shortest distance between any 2 points. That's simple.
Okay. But what does that mean exactly? Now, I had an email this week from Akimbo, and we were discussing, you know, basically what space is and what's that made out of. So everybody has their own little idea about, you know, what space is. So certainly if you're talking about inertia, then inertia is a property that space has, right? And so
Space has the property of inertia? I don't think so.
no, you don't think inertia is a property of space?
No.
Well, that could be. What do you think is a property of? Or what do you think about what inertia is? Let's just start there.
Inertia
That's
is the
Newton's
property
first
of
law, right?
matter, according to the physics books.
What was it you said, Harry?
Inertia is a property of matter or mass.
Oh, yeah. Inertia is a property of matter. Well, certainly that's what we observe it in. So
Matter
if I throw,
and velocity.
yeah,
MV.
so if I throw a ball, it has a choice of doing one of two things. So if there wasn't inertia, then you might think if I throw a ball, it moves as long as I apply energy. But as soon as I stop applying energy, it should just stop, right? That's maybe one thing that it could possibly do, right?
Well, Franklin, I would comment that this is a philosophical problem that's been debated prior to Aristotle. And Aristotle commented on this, and he defined space as the boundary of the container. And I can't remember exactly, but if you want me to cite some books that you can read about it, then I've got plenty of books here in my library, and they go from philosophical books from ancient Greece to modern books. And I don't know that anybody's ever solved this problem. So I don't really see the point in discussing it.
Well, that's what we do. We take points which have been discussed
Well, this isn't
in
really a
Venatum.
scientific problem, Franklin. It's a philosophical problem. That's the whole point.
I would say no. It's not really a philosophical problem in the way that we do observe inertia. It is a thing, right? We do observe Newton's first law, so that's not philosophical. That is something that definitely happens, you know. And when Musser asks, you know, what is a straight line, I think that's a legitimate question, right?
Is
if
it
I
easier?
throw
Is it easier? And you impart a velocity to it, it just continues along. MV.
well, I suppose that's one solution, is you could just say that's just what happens, right? Because I was trying to explore
Yeah,
it in
but-
terms of, well, what would happen if there wasn't inertia? I mean, can we even talk about a world where inertia doesn't exist, right?
Why
Where
would we want to do that, Franklin?
just to compare that against the world that we are in, right? So if we had that would help distinguish what inertia is, because in order to tell what inertia is, then it's helpful to know what would happen if inertia wasn't, right? Or otherwise, we could just decide that, well, inertia has to happen because
Well, if you want
when
to
I
know
throw,
what inertia is, I suggest you read Newton's book. He invented the concept, as far as I know, and it's a concept that was invented by this guy Newton, and so it's a model basically.
Well, Newton's concept in the first law and so on is, I suppose, an idealization. And it's again a question of what definition we take. I mean, we say, look, let's do an experiment. And we find that the law of inertia doesn't hold exactly. So then we say, oh, there must be something causing that. Oh, it's the atmosphere, or it's friction with the surface on which an object is moving. But in the absence of those, this inertial effect would exist 100%. And with regard to the straight line, we could say, well, here's the definition of a straight line, the Euclidean definition of a straight line, and objects have inertia, and without being influenced by external forces, they will follow that straight line. But we can also reverse it, and we can say, well, put the thing in an ideal situation, no external forces, and let it move, and that's the definition of a straight line. So it's a bit which way we start and which way we're moving.
well, I think we got to put a line in the sand.
I think.
So I'm going to put a line in the sand that a straight line is with respect to the say the Earth-centered frame, and I say that because using our scientific instruments, we can detect the 24-hour rotation of the Earth, using these laser ring detectors. So we can detect that surface movement going around 24 hours, and we can detect really nothing else. So, because in order to determine what is straight, I think you do have to determine an absolute frame of reference. So I'll pick one. The Earth-centered frame of reference. It appears to be a stable frame of reference to the Earth, I suppose.
Maybe an easier way to view it would be to take a space capsule that's long and cylindrical, and without a gravitational field, and you just had some sort of mass at one end, and you'd have, it would be circular, and you'd have it marked at the center, and at the other end you also have a circle with the center marked, and you would just take that mass from one spot in the center of the one circle, you give it its little push, and you would see if it goes all the way and hits the other circle at the other end. I guess would sort of define your straight line.
Well,
yeah, according to inertia, the straight line is the path that an object would take without being under the influence of any other forces.
Right.
And so you could find that, right? And you can even find that on the Earth. Like that's how the Foucault pendulum kind of finds the straight line, because the Earth rotates, and that's why I'm saying that the Earth-centered frame should be considered straight, because the Foucault pendulum can detect that we're not exactly, that the Earth itself is not in inertial frame.
Yeah, that's the daily
stationary
detection of that, as you say, Franklin. But I mean, if you took the ECI frame to be inertial, it's approximately inertial, but if you took it to be exactly inertial, well, then the ellipse that is described by the Earth would be just a straight line. So we're using something external to the Earth to establish that ellipse. Unless you're a complete relativist or you're a geocentrist and you say, well, that doesn't exist or it doesn't matter. But we are using sort of an absolute space concept, or the universe at large, as I sometimes call it, to establish that. Or maybe the sun-centered system, the heliocentric system, to establish that ellipse.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to introduce the concept that, well, yeah, pick one. But
Why aren't you picking? I mean, to me, it seems to me that what a straight line is determined optically.
In what way?
Well, I stand in one place, which I call a point, and you stand in the other place, which you call a point, and I cite a straight line between the two, and that's done optically.
Like pulling a string between two people.
So
Well,
if I'm around a black hole and it causes my laser beam to kind of curve around, then would that still be considered straight line?
Well, now you've thrown in an objection. Essentially, when people are doing geodetic measurements and stuff, they use things like LIDAR and laser. The surveyors use lasers, as I understand it. And so that's what they use.
Yes, that's absolutely true. That's what they use.
So
Usually
the
use lasers. And normally under...
defines the straight line is the path that a laser beam takes.
I suppose that's another important observation. Yeah, that's another thing.
But
Laser beam.
in a gravitational field, the laser beam is not necessarily straight. It is bent.
And that's also
you know
true.
That how?
Well, they do see these stars, and they can see what's behind them because there's this some kind of lensing going on there.
Yeah, but they throw in these corrections after the fact.
But I think here on the planet Earth, that it's one of those things where, yeah, it changes a little bit, but by such a small amount that it's just not going to make any difference.
But it's generally conceded that if you gave orders to a pilot to fly in a straight line from here, say due west, he'd circumnavigate the Earth, and that would be a straight line because of the geodetic properties.
Well, he'd do it based on GPS more than likely, and he'd stay at a constant altitude, right?
Right.
And
but then you might have the Earth rotating underneath you, and then
more than likely he would be told fly from New York to Los Angeles along a specific path. So I think there's a sort of an esoteric argument. I guess what Franklin is really trying to get at, what is the nature of space? That's what Franklin is really trying to say. And he's trying to define it in terms of the old Euclidean, Newtonian idea of inertia, okay? And I don't really think that's, the physicists teach it in the books, but, the modern technique of doing measurement doesn't really use that definition.
Well, see, so Musser, he's interested, so he knows what a straight line is, but he's more interested about the frame that it is straight in respect to. So I have some more specific ideas about that. Now, as an etherist, my belief, my personal belief, not supported by any actual physics, is that space is actually filled with particles. So if you take a bell jar and you evacuate all the air out of it, such that there is not even a single molecule of atmosphere left inside the bell jar, I would say that there is still a very dense sea of matter particles contained within that jar. And that sea of matter particles is what is mediating, say, the electromagnetic wave and the magnetic field and the gravity field as well.
So there is a form of matter.
But is that science?
Science is always about making hypotheses and then running experiments or finding experiments that support your hypotheses. So that's science. So as science, we try and figure out what is quote unquote space, right?
You hypothesize. So you said that there are these particles in the vacuum, but you have no proof that there are particles in the vacuum. So you're not talking science. You're just speculating.
No, there is proof that there's particles in the vacuum.
Where is there proof?
I always show the Lamb experiment, which shows that in order to explain the spectra, there must be a sea of positive and negative charges around the electrons. That is proof.
But they don't.
That is proof. Another proof is that if there were particles,
I don't accept that proof.
Well, it's positive evidence then, okay?
I don't accept any of your proofs, Franklin.
Well, that's fine. That's part of science. I mean, the other thing is
you're not doing science. You don't really have an experiment that demonstrates that these particles actually exist. What you have is some theoretical interpretations that say they could exist.
That's what science is about.
No, it's not. It's about doing experiments that prove things are so.
Yes, it is. And
these particles exist. You got no proof that these particles exist. It's nothing more than an hypothesis on your part, and it's not.
Well, it's not proof, but it's supporting evidence. I mean, that's a supporting evidence that I have for my hypothesis. My specific hypothesis.
Evidence, Franklin. So your theory is nothing more than talk.
No, it's more than talk because we have experiments.
No, it's not more than
the
talk.
hypothesis makes specific predictions, and those predictions are bore out by the experiments, and that is the scientific method, right? That's the scientific method.
All of your so-called claims, and so what you're saying is worthless because I reject everything you say. So,
and that you're welcome to say that.
Right.
But I'm saying that there is specific evidence to suggest. I mean, even mainstream will say, I mean, they will occasionally say these things like, "There's the quantum foam sea," right? Okay, what the heck is that thing? They'll say that vacuum space is filled with near infinite amounts of energy. You know, what do they mean by that? They'll say that the quantum space is filled with virtual particles. You know, what do they mean by that? All of that stuff is in the mainstream.
They haven't said that the particles exist in empty space. They've said that energy or some kind of energy exists in empty space. They didn't say
there's an energy that's not empty.
So your argument is null and void, Franklin. It's just, it's just not an argument. That's why people aren't accepting what you say in their emails.
Well, let's just take one specific experiment. Okay. We have the phenomenon called pair production. Are you familiar with pair production?
We've been over this before, Franklin. For 10 years, you've been talking about this. And for 10 years, I've told you, no, you're wrong. So let's just not talk about it anymore.
Well, you haven't explained to me how I am wrong. That's why we continue
convincing anybody.
This is why, you see, you're just shouting me down. You haven't explained at all why is it that
you're not convincing anybody. You're just using this as a forum to promote your pet theory.
That's exactly what we're doing. That's what we're here for. That any dissident scientists, they have their pet theory, and they can come here and we can discuss it reasonably. Now, by you just saying that I'm wrong, I mean, you're welcome to do that. I mean, I say
you're wrong.
I think that's great.
Have any convincing evidence, Franklin. Your evidence is not convincing to anybody.
Well, it's not convincing to you, but here I would like a discussion of why that isn't convincing.
I just told you why, Franklin.
And why?
Because you make it up out of nothing.
Okay, so pair production, did I make that out of nothing?
Your explanation is refuted by mainstream textbooks.
And is everything in mainstream textbooks going to be correct? Like if we went back 1,000 years and look at the mainstream textbooks, was everything in there correct?
Evasion. All you do is make up excuses and evasions.
I don't evade. And what way have I evaded?
Fine. If somebody comes on here and says, Franklin, you're absolutely right, and I believe you, then I'll pay attention. So far, nobody has done that.
Well, I don't know that anybody does that with anybody's theory. I mean, we've got James here, and he's got a theory of his binary mechanics, and we have Michael Antesky's theory of his ether balls, and we have all kinds of different people, and then we have Ray, who doesn't have any theories of his own, but he's happy to comment on them, and I think that those are all healthy things. But
Well,
what we don't want to do is we don't want to have people
made up by particles, Franklin. I'm sorry, there's no evidence of that. And so continuing to talk about it doesn't convince me. I'd rather talk about something else.
Well, let's see here. We have Musser, who thinks that he would be happy to hear Franklin's theories. So there's a vote of support.
Well, you found one person that you can convince that you know what you're talking about when you don't.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually far easier to talk with lay people about this than with people who are heavily entrenched in the mainstream.
I'm not heavily entrenched in the mainstream, Franklin. I just don't think you know what you're talking about. Okay, you're saying that there are particles in empty space because you say so, and you've got no proof. There's no.
Okay, so let me go ahead and defend that. Although, Harry,
empty space.
Harry, for a moment, so I'm going to go and defend myself, and for a moment, I'm going to turn off your microphone because I know you cannot help but interrupt me. Okay. I'm not trying to be rude or anything like that, but because I can't.
Constant nonsense. Always.
Okay, now I'm not trying to be rude to you, Harry. Now, I said that I just know that I will not be able to explain my theory while you have the microphone, right? So I understand your claim that you think that I don't have any supporting evidence. And what I have not heard is why you don't think that evidence is supported, right? So I claim things like pair production. So my specific theory is that plausible. And what would that predict? This is what we do with science. We come up with a hypothesis. Nobody knows whether it's true or false. But you come up with a hypothesis, and then you say, well, what does that hypothesis predict? So if space, what's right in front of me is like jam-packed full of a sea of positrons and electrons, then what would we expect? Well, one of the things we would expect is that we can eject the positron and electron from parent empty space, and then we should be able to see them, right? That is one prediction that we could make, that if there's a sea of positrons and electrons, then we ought to be able to show that blank space, vacuum space, is filled with these things. So any evidence of positrons and electrons just popping out of nowhere would be supporting evidence that they had existed. And this is the way that we detect neutral particles any other way, because there are a lot of neutral particles that have been discovered by science. And the way that we detect them is that we see them decaying into visible particles, because otherwise things like neutrons, you can't really see them and detect them in any other way other than to observe them either directly interacting by contact or by decaying. So we do see this evidence. I bring that up as evidence that we can eject positrons and electrons from bare vacuum space. So that tells me that they existed beforehand. Now the mainstream interpretation of this is the conversion of energy in the form of gamma rays to matter. So because that's the only alternative. If the positron and electron were not there beforehand, then that means that they were somehow created. But and then that's a possibility. But no one knows how that exactly happens, right? No one knows how you can take an electron and make it out of energy. There's no explanation of how that can happen. So the question is, what's more plausible? Is it more plausible that an electron just, is some kind of a ball of energy? And as among dissidents, that is a very popular idea. That an electron is, like if you're Cornelius, you would say that an electron is just a standing wave pattern, right? That its electron is somehow a wave, right? And that the gamma ray is just coming in and just making another different kind of wave. And certainly that might be possible. Logically, I think that all hangs together, except that, I'm violently opposed to that idea because I don't think waves and particles react in such a different way that that I don't like that idea. It just seems more plausible that if you see positrons, electrons coming out of nowhere, that they were there before, right? So, but presuming that that all works. So, I mean, that's just one example. There's several other examples of reasons why we think space might be filled with positrons and electrons. Another major one is that just based on first principles and the properties of positrons and electrons, if you postulate that C and you can calculate the speed of the speed at which waves propagate through that material, it just happens to be the speed of light. So the speed of wave propagation through positron electron C, given the properties we know about, is very close calculated to the speed of light, which is another piece of evidence saying that indeed this thing that the waves are going through are made out of this kind of C, because it can reproduce the speed of light. So I'd say there is a fair amount of evidence that we do have this thing. I mean, it's a little bit different than other dissidents. Other dissidents come up with other things, like Michael Antesky, he has his ether balls. He makes it up out of that. But I would say that I continue to stick with this idea that it's a positron electron C, because we know what positrons and electrons are. So that's why I tend to favor that kind of thing. But presuming that there is a C, then that C itself would present a absolute frame which you could do inertia with, right? So Musser asks, what is the actual frame of reference that we think straight is? And I would say it's that, whatever that bubble of ether that is around you determines what really straight is. So I initially said that I would declare the Earth-centered inertial frame as the frame of reference, because I think that with at least within the gravitational realm of the Earth, that we are sitting in like this ether bubble, and we are spinning inside of that ether bubble. And when you throw a ball, it's going to go relative to that frame, the one that's centered in the Earth, not the one that we're sitting on the surface here, because that is turning within what would be an absolute frame of reference.
With that note, Franklin, could I interject a few thoughts?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm a little bit, unhappy that it seems that the speaker, I don't know his name, but the speaker that you shut off his mic, please turn his mic.
That would be Harry.
On.
Harry, we've known each other for a long time, so.
Some of the statements seem to border on an ad hominem, if I said that word right, ad hominem type of attack. You don't know what you're talking about. What you say is not, concerning Y is not evidence supporting X hypothesis. These kinds of statements. I'd like to introduce some ideas of how we can help each other. And in my experience in being a reviewer and in chairing site visit teams up to sometimes as many as a dozen or 18 different specialists in different areas for group program grants, which are a collection of many research proposals from a particular university, where each member of the site visit team has to evaluate whether that project should be funded or revised or whatever. My guidance to these experts, that I was the chairman of, was your objective is not to introduce your own ideas. Okay? You all have your own theories and you're doing research, and that's why you're here. But you're here to help the person who's speaking, the applicant. And in the case of this chat, the applicant are the participants who are presenting your ideas, as Franklin was a moment ago. So that rather than just say you don't know what you're talking about, well, if any of my site visit team, we meet in the hotel after we visit the university, were to come out with that kind of a statement, I'd almost say, gently, we don't really care what you think the person knows what they're talking about. What we care about is what that applicant should know based upon your expertise to help increase the scientific merit of his proposal. If the applicant cites evidence supporting his hypothesis as part of his introduction, it's simply not acceptable to say that evidence does not support that hypothesis. That doesn't help the applicant at all. You have to explain exactly why that evidence is unrelated or not supportive of that hypothesis. So are you getting the drift? When it comes to methods, it's not acceptable to say, oh, this applicant has no idea of correct methods. You have to explain what the correct method would be. So the applicant could possibly, if his proposal is rejected, can improve on his proposal. So in other words, reviewers have to learn what it is that's helpful to the applicant. I've been saying the applicant like in a research proposal, but in a way, every participant here is sort of like an applicant. Whatever statements they make, it doesn't do any good just to make ad hominem statements of this person is incompetent or this person doesn't know what they're talking about. If you can't explain what the critical issues are that makes you think that sort of a thing in a way that is helpful to the speaker, it's best not to say anything at all. Because absolutely nothing.
When did I ever get the opportunity to say that?
I can't hear you. Could you speak up?
Talking. He never listens. He never listens. He just keeps on talking. Okay. I want to know where there's an experiment done by mainstream physicists that show that space is full of particles, as Franklin claims. He has not produced such an experiment.
Lamb shift experiment. Look at it.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, well,
You asked for an experiment. That is an experiment.
Howard, you can't just say that Franklin's mention of particle, pair production out of supposed vacuum supports his general outlook. That's a worthless statement. You have to say why.
Excuse me, worthless
it does not
statement?
support. And if you can't say that, it's best to say nothing at all. In other words, you are not prepared to help the
You're just
applicant.
violating your own rules there, sir. You just violated your own rules. You did.
What? I don't know who's being addressed here.
It's worthless. Okay, so yeah, right. Okay.
Could you turn up your mic a little bit, your volume?
Excuse me. I don't agree with Franklin's theory, and he knows it. Okay. We've talked about this before. It's been explained to him numerous times that this whole electron positron seed doesn't exist and can't exist, and explained to him why numerous times by numerous people. I don't know why we have to continue to talk about it here.
Because you never have actually explained it.
I'm not the one explaining it, Franklin. It's you who has to justify what you say is true, and nobody but you accepts it. Nobody.
And we're just asking you to explain your point.
Excuse me, I'm talking now. The discussion in the email is people explaining to you why you're wrong. You come on here and then try to justify what you said was correct, despite the fact that everybody in the email discussion disagrees with what you say.
And that's not true. Normally, people don't respond at all. Which is kind of a funny reaction, because I've noticed this in the email chats that, I'll deliver this, ultimate argument, and then nobody replies to it, right? Now, they could have said that, your argument is wrong for such and so reasons, but normally the discussion just stops right there. It's kind of like, if you can't say anything negative, don't say anything at all, which is kind of like the opposite of what James is saying.
My question is, why do we have to regurgitate this discussion here on the Science Chat when we could talk about other things that are more interesting? Why do we
because this is the topic. The topic is space. The topic is inertia.
Why are we always talking about you?
We are not always talking about me. Sometimes we're talking about James. Sometimes Ian is doing a lot of talking. Sometimes we have
let's let
whoever wants to do it.
Else other than your particular pet theory. I mean, every time I come in here and listen, you're talking about your pet theory. Okay.
Yes, and that's true. So if you don't want to hear my pet theories, then because that may also be because I actually have an answer to some of these questions. Like, what is inertia? If you ask me about what is inertia, yeah, I'll give you my opinion.
You think you have an answer until you present it in the email discussion, and then people tell you that you're wrong, and then you get upset and you want to come on here and explain why you're right. Okay.
No, they don't. Well, they're just like you, Larry.
If people in I don't know what this email apparently you've got an email list or something going here. I don't know what that is, but like the fact that everybody says X person is wrong on X statement, I mean that's a useless statistic. Okay, really useless. If you think of what Franklin or any of us is saying as sort of an applicant applying for a grant, are you going to say we're going to deny funds to this researcher because I think he's full of crap? No, you can't say that. You have to, you're saying Franklin has to defend his position. I'm saying you have to defend your critique of Franklin. And so far, from what I've seen, all I've seen is vague statements and ad hominems and what's in the textbooks and so forth. I tell you what, if you were on a review group that I was chairing back when I was a younger man, I would recommend to my superiors at NSF and NIH, don't ask this person to come. They're just a bullheaded person. The reviewers are supposed to help the applicant realize why his application or his statements are unacceptable and not funded, and exactly what is wrong. The literature review is inadequate. The methods, the operational definitions have this problem or that problem, to be so that specifically that speaker, or in the case of this forum, and or that applicant in case of a site visit, will know what they have to do to get funded to improve their application. But simply just saying that
excuse me, let's get back to the point. I want to see some proof from Franklin that particles exist in a vacuum. Show me the proof, Franklin.
And I showed you the proof. You look up the Lamb shift, and then you explain to me why that isn't proof.
I don't accept your claimed proof. Okay.
And why not? This is what we're asking you. It's like, great, you don't accept it. Why do you not accept it?
Because there's no evidence that particles exist in a vacuum as produced by mainstream nuclear physics experiments.
And the Lamb shift is a mainstream nuclear experiment. And the only way that they can possibly understand how this happens.
Particles exist
And pair production is not mainstream. You see, as a reviewer, Howard, you are failing
mainstream says that
why the evidence that Franklin presents is invalid and contrary to experiment or observations. Pair production has been seen in cloud chambers way back when, before accelerators.
They don't explain it in terms of Franklin's claim. Franklin claims that there's a particle called a poselectron, which is a particle that's never been predicted to exist other than by Franklin. And it is a particle that has never been shown to exist in any experiment.
Except, you know, pair production. Pair production shows it exists.
How does that?
Because if the poselectron exists, then if you put enough energy into it, it will be split apart. And then you will see a positron and electron, and you will only see them in pairs. You'll never see a bare positron coming out. Because that's the problem with the energy conversion thing is that if you're converting energy into matter, then you should be able to get a bare electron. You should be able to create, there should be some cases where you're creating there's only enough energy for one electron. And yeah, it should come out, but we never see that. In pair production, it absolutely has to be in pairs.
So
and
where
why
are
would
these
that be?
Electrons? Show me where they've detected a poselectron.
Well, I believe you could detect a poselectron because they're basically masquerading as neutrons. Basically, a neutron is basically just a poselectron in motion. So if you were looking for a specific particle, then probably what we detect as neutrons are actually the same thing as the poselectron.
Oh, so you're saying that poselectrons and neutrons are the same thing?
They are basically the same thing. A neutron.
Okay, so then space ought to be full of neutrons.
Yes, you could essentially say that it's full of neutrons if you would like to.
It's obviously not, Franklin, so your theory is wrong.
And then why is it obviously not full of neutrons?
That's not a question. You said that positrons and neutrons are the same thing, and space is not full of neutrons. We know that. So therefore, your theory is wrong.
And how do we know that space is not full of neutrons?
Franklin, you're talking in circles.
No, I'm just asking. I mean, you came up with an objection. So what do you base that on?
You said that neutrons and poselectrons were the same thing. And then it's obvious that space is not full of neutrons. Okay. So either they're not.
Why is that obvious?
Your theory is wrong.
Why is that obvious? Because space could be filled with neutrons. Neutrons are exceedingly hard to detect. Neutrons pass through everything as if almost they were not there. So why is it obvious that space is not filled with neutrons? Where do what support do you have for that?
They've never been detected in space.
Well, certainly we've detected neutrons in space, but the problem is that we can only detect neutrons which have significant kinetic energy.
Franklin,
if you slow them down, if you slow them all the way down to a halt.
Despite this, all this, I don't understand what you're saying. What you're saying doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand how a poselectron is a neutron. Okay, is a neutron a poselectron or not? Tell me that.
A neutron is a poselectron with some kinetic energy. That's what it really is.
Okay, so you just, all right. So I
that
guess
what's getting ejected from the atom during nuclear reactions is a positron-electron dipole.
Right, and of course they don't. Do they weigh the same? Do poselectrons and neutrons weigh the same? Do they have the same mass?
Well, mass is a measure of the resistance of a particle through space, basically. Now, the problem is that if space itself is made out of poselectrons, then you know you
Probably
can
not,
measure the mass,
right?
the resistance, and we
If they
measure it
were
what it
moving,
is.
and if these positive electrons were moving, then they become neutrons. So every time an electromagnetic wave goes through the sea of positive electrons, they would have to be moving, right?
They would be moving in an oscillatory fashion
But then they would
within.
have to become neutrons, right?
Well, effectively, structurally, there have always been neutrons.
Okay.
I mean, what you said about space being filled with neutrons would effectively be true.
Okay.
I mean, but the more important question, I mean, if you were doing this scientifically, then you would say, well, why did neutrons? I mean, the biggest objection to neutron C is that, well, neutrons only last 15 minutes. So if the world was filled with neutrons, then the whole thing would decay in a half-life of 15 minutes, and we obviously don't observe that, right? That would be a legitimate objection to that theory, right? I'm just saying that you could say that. I mean, that would be a legit objection to this whole idea.
But
You know,
wouldn't the neutron have a much larger mass than the combined masses of the positron and the electron? So how do you account for that?
well, I mean, basically, we can't account for the mass of a lot of things, like the proton mass 1,800 times more than the electron. So how do you account for that? I mean, not even mainstream can account for that. They think that the mass of the quarks that consist of the proton only account for, like, you know, a couple percent of the mass of the whole proton, right? So certainly you can't just add things together to get the mass. And it more seems to have to do with a matter of geometry and the number of things that it's made out of. But it would be too simplistic by anybody's
perhaps
interpretation, you know, that the mass should be this or that, because that would be a legitimate objection, that the mass of my positive electron is like, you know, 2 electron masses. That's what it should be, right? Because that's all it has. But the mass of the neutron is nearly the mass of the proton, which is 1,836. So why is it that and not 2, right?
Yeah, that's the question. Yes.
Because the mass should be 2. But I'm telling you that even mainstream with their quarks, they're saying that the mass of the proton should be like, you know, should also be like 3 electron masses or something arbitrary like that, something way below the observed masses. And then they have to do this ad hoc thing about that they've got these, you know, gluon quark, whatever, they make up some particle, and they say that the energy of those things moving around, that accounts for the mass. Now, me personally, I account for mass as being the resistance of an object moving through this sea of particles, right? So you have this sea of particles that has to push them aside. And so you have this proton. Proton consists, at least in my theories, consists of at least 3 objects, 2 positrons and electrons. So it consists of at least 3 objects, but the mass of the proton is not 3. It's 1,800 times more. And the reason why is that I think the resistance goes up like exponentially, like to the 7th power, when you're trying to get something to go through the sea. It's like if you take a foam block and you stick it into a cube, a Lexan cube that exactly fits the foam block, it's very easy to put that in. But you take another foam block and you try and shove that into the same Lexan block, it takes a lot more energy to shove that in. And then when you take a third one and you try and shove it in there, it may take 2,000 times as much energy to get that third one in there, right? It's not a linear process.
I have no idea.
Now, there's no proof on that, but that's just kind of an analogy on, you know, why is it the mass should so massively increase with the number of actual particles
I have no
involved.
idea what you're talking about.
You don't understand that if I take a
completely
foam,
have no concept of what you're saying. I completely don't understand anything that you're talking about here. I don't understand any of it. Not any of it. Not a bit of it.
well, let's see if Ian understood that. Ian, did you understand that? Apparently, Harry didn't understand it at all about my foam explanation. So I just wondered, did you understand that, or did that go over your head as well?
Well, it depends what you mean by understanding. I think I appreciated that you were trying to draw on an analogy, you know, and to that extent, I understood it. But
do you understand the analogy? Because I'm trying to justify. So why is it a particle which consists of 3 pieces can register as like 1,800 times, you know, taking 1,800 times more energy than something that only consists of 1 piece?
yes, that was my question, and you've.
But
you've
did I answer that? You know, I don't
But
want
you've
you to go-
endeavored to answer it. Yes.
But do you understand it? Do you accept it? Or is Harry right that, you know, what I just said doesn't make any sense and, you know, you're just being polite and.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for Harry. Harry has to speak for himself, and similarly, you have to speak for yourself. I don't want to get too embroiled between the two of you and just this conversation.
Well,
but
that doesn't have anything to do
my
with Harry.
my
That just,
basic question, you made an attempt to answer it. Certainly, you know, whether one is satisfied with that answer or not is another question.
I didn't understand what he said.
I'm just saying the mass goes up exponential to the number of components. So if you go and you raise 3 to the 7th power, then you do get something about 1,800 times. So 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. So you got 7 times, you get about 1,800 or 2,000 or something close to that, right? So you would go, so if you have 1 particle, you know, the unit is 1. You do that. 2 particles, you raise that to the 7th power. That's what you would get for 2 particles. You go 3 particles, you raise that to the 7th power, you get something which is about what you get for the proton mass. That's what I'm saying. Do you understand that? That's a simple math.
See, I might question the more fundamental concept that mass is a relative quantity that's determined by resistance through space or something. I tend to think that mass is maybe a fundamental property. You know,
but actually, I would disagree with that as well. I mean, the one experiment that I point out to is that they've done like these solid state experiments where they measure the mass of electrons as it travels through, I don't know, say a wire or some other medium. And you can measure the mass, you know, it's kind of the same way you would, but they find that, say, if you are putting a electron through a region of space which has, say, an excess of positive charges or excess of negative charges, actually the mass of the electron changes. It's not a constant. It depends upon the environment upon which it's immersed in. So I would just, you know, that's an experiment saying that mass is not actually an inherent property belonging to a particle. That thing can vary.
See, some of these things are a bit philosophical or interpretative. I mean, you know, you can say, well, the mass changes. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But you can also say that the effective energy of the system changes. It's like when you get the ratio of the electronic charge to the mass. Well, you can do certain experiments and you can say, well, that changes. But therefore, is the mass changing, or is it, you know, more connected with the charge or the energy of the system? So you've defined it as the mass changing, and that's one way of defining it. But I don't think it's the only way.
All right. Well, it looks like we're coming towards the end of our time here. We did have a few other comments here that I wanted to show. So Mike Singer is bringing up the fact that positron electrons pairs that has to happen in the presence of matter. That actually you have to do the gamma ray in the presence of a very large atom. Is actually the deal, and that you can't create positron electron pairs even given arbitrary amounts of gamma ray. You can crank it up as high as you want, and you will not get pair production. But my response to that is that, you know, you have to explain why that is. Why is it that the pair production only happens in the presence of a large atom? And I think the reason is that in bare space, you know, the elasticity of the positron electron C is such that it can accept a total and an infinite amount of energy, because the the positron electrons are always free to move. So there's no incentive to tear them apart. But I say if you put a big gigantic atom right next to the positron electron pair, it's going to collide into that giant atom. And then that's going to create recoil forces enough to split apart the positron electron pair. So that is actually another, I would say that's how that is supported.
Hey, Franklin, the prediction would be that if you have a bunch of gamma rays that are hitting this electron positron C, and then it hits a positive electron, it splits them apart, which is what you said. You didn't say anything in your prediction. You made the statement that when the energy pulls them apart, okay, the positive electron gets broken up into its two parts. That should happen everywhere and not necessarily in the presence of a more massive atom. So your theory is disproved.
No, I think I mean, once again, you're not hearing what I'm saying, and that I just explained, why I believe that is. And I didn't specifically say, I just said that pair production shows that there were particles beforehand. Not necessarily the mechanism, because if you go into the mechanism, you see that you do need to have these large atoms present. Or the other way you can create positrons, electrons is just by plane collisions. You collide two lead atoms together, you get a gazillion positrons and electrons, right? Seemingly from nowhere. So that's the other way. I mean, it's a big mess. You can't say it's pair production, but that's another way you can rip particles out of the vacuum space with these gigantic collisions. But that was one other comment I wanted to get to. And so Musser had one other comment. So it says, so the straight line in the middle of galaxy is still in respect to Earth, because I declared the Earth as being the absolute fixed frame of reference. And if that were true, then yeah, straight line with respect to the middle of galaxy is still respect to the Earth, and that would make some geocentrists happy. But what I think is that there's a concept of local ether. But I'm not sure if it's true or not. I mean, you have to send a spaceship out and actually try and measure this stuff. And some people have proposed that, because maybe you might find that in fact that everything is in fact in respect to the Earth, and that the geocentrists were right all along. But until someone does that, I prefer to think that that the gravity around the Earth gathers around it its own ether bubble, just like it gathers around its own atmosphere. So even though the Earth is moving at something like 360,000 miles per hour, the air inside my room is still, and it's not moving. And that is what I use to determine what a straight line is, right? It's in respect to my local ether. And some UFO people think that, for example, their little UFO creates also its own little ether bubble. And so the physics inside your little bubble are different from the general physics, so that these UFOs can do these 90-degree turns, which would kill the occupants inside normally because of inertia. But because you're sitting inside your own ether bubble, then you don't feel that at all, because you're carrying your own little ether bubble. What is a straight line and what is inertia is determined by what's inside your bubble and not what's going on with the outside of the spaceship. So that's another kind of dramatic way of showing, what the actual reference frame is. In your spaceship, you can build your own reference frame, is what they were saying. But, that's another way of just thinking about how how inertia would work if you could control it, and if it's controlled by, space, or it's a property of space. That's why I was kind of going back saying, inertia is actually a property of space. Because if you could create your own little space bubble, then you could see that that's true, and it didn't really have to do with the actual matter. But okay, so that does it for this episode of the Science Morning Science Chat. I thank you for everyone participating. And yes, we're still open for business because we're virtual and observing all our social distancing. And we initially started out talking the hour about the coronavirus, and as dissidents to be skeptical about what we're seeing, and what the statistics are, and whether and all of the social distancing is working or worthwhile, or are we going to just have to keep doing this forever, and eventually we're just going to have to find out that we just have to just let everybody get it or not. So those are all questions for science. And then we went into a discussion about, what is inertia? What do we mean by inertia? What would it mean if we didn't have inertia? And specifically, when we say straight line, what is that in relationship to? Right? So I started to espouse some of my theories, and of course Harry is right in that, when people ask me questions, I try and give answers. But of course, everyone else is free to give their answers. But I just have very specific answers, and so I gave one that there's space is a specific made out of specific substance, and we had an interesting discussion about what do good objections look like. So I think James made a very good point that if you're just saying that this guy's crazy, he's wrong, I don't accept his evidence, that is not really that helpful. You have to go in a little bit deeper than that and say exactly why you think that something's wrong. So we kind of went a little bit into that. It's like what is the evidence for your particles, and if it's like a neutron, then why does it do these things? And those are fruitful discussions, I think. But just saying that what you're saying is wrong, not very helpful. So, but that would conclude this episode of the Mars Science Morning Chat, and invite you all here same time, same place next week, and bring your friends, because we're all, there's nothing else better to do, right? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.